Before the stars knew his name, before the Imperium was even a whisper in the dark, there was terror, a broken world at the end of its own age. Skies of ash and lightning stretched over ruined continents. Nations had long since perished, replaced by warring techno-barbarian tribes who fought over scraps of ancient wonder. The planet's heartbeat was faint, buried beneath the wreckage of its forgotten golden ages. Yet, beneath those clouds, hidden deep within the mountains of the Himalaya, he labored. The being who would one day be called the Emperor of Mankind walked among his shadowed children unseen, studying them, learning their ways, and mourning their endless violence. For centuries, he wandered terror in silence, wearing many faces: a king, a priest, a scholar, a soldier, until he saw clearly what humanity had become: scattered, blind, and lost. And so, when the time was right, he began his great work. In secret vaults beneath the Himalayan plateau, the Emperor gathered remnants of forgotten science and fragments of his own immeasurable power. He called forth artisans, gene forgers, and savants who could still think beyond superstition. And there, within the mountain's heart, the first notes of creation echoed, the crafting of perfection itself. He would make warriors, but not mere soldiers. He would make guardians, but not slaves. He would make beings who embodied his vision, flawless in mind, body, and spirit. Before the Legends Astartes, before even the Primarchs, there were the Custodians. Each one was not grown, but crafted, hand-shaped by the Emperor's will, sculpted with care and deliberation. The process was unlike that which would later birth the Space Marines. There were no mass-produced gene seeds, no wide-scale implantation. Instead, each custodian was individually forged, a masterpiece of bioalchemy and psychic engineering. Each stood taller than any mortal, their flesh as resilient as ceramite, their reflexes faster than thought, their will unbreakable. They were not numbered in the legions, but known by name, for each was unique, a living extension of the Emperor's own mind. In those early years, terror's darkness trembled. Across the plains and shattered cities, golden shapes began to appear, towering figures who spoke rarely but carried out the Emperor's will with divine precision. To the warlords of old Earth, they seemed like angels descended from the heavens, faces concealed by featureless visors of burnished gold, their voices calm and terrible. When the Emperor moved to unite the techno-barbarian kingdoms, it was the custodians who walked before him. They were his spear and his shield, striking down tyrants, dismantling their armies, and shattering their false empires. Entire nations surrendered upon seeing them approach. The tribes called them many names: the companions, the gilded giants, the silent sons of the Emperor. Yet among themselves, they bore no titles of pride. They knew only their purpose: to serve, to guard, and to never fail. As the Golden Legions marched across the face of terror, the Emperor's dream began to take form. One by one, the techno-barbarian kings were brought low. The Thunder Warriors, crude, savage prototypes of later genetic warriors, fought at the Emperor's command, but it was the custodians who ensured his safety, who executed his enemies when diplomacy failed, who stood closest when the Emperor raised the banner of unification. The Thunder Warriors were fierce, but flawed. Their creation was rushed, their lifespans short, their minds unstable. They were weapons, not men, and when their purpose was fulfilled, they were ended. But the custodians endured. When the last warlord's palace fell, and the Emperor ascended the thrones of terror, it was they who stood upon the marble steps beside him. The storms cleared. The planet, scarred and weary, knelt before a single golden figure, and behind him stood his 10,000, radiant as dawn, breaking after endless night. For the first time in millennia, humanity had a ruler, not born of greed or fear, but of destiny. And so began the dawn of the Imperium of man. And at its heart, the Adeptus Custodes, the golden guardians of the Emperor, took their eternal place beside the throne. But the Emperor's vision reached far beyond Terra. The stars themselves awaited his hand, and the Golden Legion would soon follow him into the void, to bring order where chaos reigned. The Emperor's palace upon Terra was not yet the colossal labyrinth it would one day become. In those first golden decades of unification, it was a fortress of radiant stone and silvered glass, rising like a spear from the Himalayan mountains. Beneath it ran chambers upon chambers of quiet industry, laboratories aglow with sacred light, where science and sorcery walked hand in hand beneath the Emperor's guiding gaze. Here, within the sanctum that mortals would later call the gene forge of the master of mankind, the 10,000 were made. Each custodian was not only a body of gold and iron, but a mind sculpted to perfection. Where the Space Marines, who would come later, were born of gene seed implantation, massed from the bloodlines of a Primarch, the custodians were singular, each one a distinct expression of the Emperor's will. They were not grown in vats. They were raised through trial, instruction, and personal touch. A custodian's creation began with a chosen mortal, a child, perhaps, or a youth discovered among the Emperor's conquered peoples. These were not chosen for strength alone, but for balance, for composure, intelligence, and the faint spark of potential that could endure divine transformation. The process was long, sometimes lasting decades. Every cell within their bodies was remade, their bones reforged with dense, gold-tinged composites. Their muscles grew denser, finer, more responsive than any mortals. Their minds expanded. Synaptic networks restructured to process thought at impossible speed, and their souls were fortified, brightened, refined to resist the whispering madness of the warp itself. And when they awoke, it was as if the Emperor had breathed part of himself into them. They remembered their humanity, the faces of those they once were, but felt no pain at its loss. For they were something new, something more. They were his. Each custodian was then taught the arts of war and wisdom. Their training was endless, a ballet of precision, meditation, and killing grace. They learned to fight with every weapon known to man, but preferred their own sacred tools, the guardian spear, a weapon that combined a finely balanced power blade with a bolter built into its shaft. Elegant and deadly, it reflected their nature. Perfect balance between mastery and might. In the great training halls beneath the palace, the custodians practiced in silence. The sound of their blades striking was like rain upon steel, rhythmic, calm, and absolute. Every motion was art, every strike, poetry. To them, war was not chaos. It was ritual, a form of devotion. The Emperor himself would often walk among them. He spoke to them not as a distant god, but as a father might to his chosen sons. To some, he gave personal instruction. To others, he gave names, blessings, or silent nods of approval that meant more than any word. Each custodian bore a unique name and a distinct identity. They were not interchangeable warriors like the later Astartes. They were individuals, scholars, poets, philosophers, and killers all. They spoke amongst themselves of purpose, of duty, of what it meant to serve perfection. Their order was not bound by ranks in the conventional sense. Instead, their hierarchy was formed of roles, fluid and personal. Some served as emissaries, representing the Emperor to the mortal lords of Terra. Others became keepers of knowledge, guarding the archives beneath the palace. Some were chosen to stand ever beside him. These would become the companions, the closest of all custodians to the Emperor's presence. And among them, legends began to form. There was Aquila, first bearer of the Eagle Standard, who stood at the Emperor's right hand during the signing of the Unification Accords. There was Constantine Valdor, the Captain General, first among equals, whose calm mind and indomitable will guided the custodians through the Emperor's wars. He was not merely a general, but a philosopher of battle, a man who could weigh the worth of a single action against the destiny of an age. Valdor was more than a warrior. He was the Emperor's voice when the master of mankind chose silence. To some, he was second only to the Emperor himself. It was he who ensured that every custodian understood the meaning of their existence, not to rule, not to conquer, but to protect. Thus, while the armies of Thunder Warriors stormed across Terra's battlefields, slaughtering and subjugating, the custodians moved differently. They were precision, not fury. They appeared where the Emperor's person was threatened, where diplomacy needed the weight of divine presence, or where a single perfect strike could achieve what 10,000 warriors could not. As the Thunder Warriors' campaign ended and their flawed bodies began to fail, it was the custodians who stood watch over their passing. Some say that Valdor himself oversaw the final extinction of those unstable giants, ending their agony with solemn reverence. The Emperor's design had evolved, refined from the crude to the sublime. Now, at last, his true warriors stood ready. When the storms over Terra began to part and the skies cleared, revealing the stars beyond, the custodians were the first to see them, and the first to understand that their duty would stretch far beyond the cradle of mankind. The Emperor's gaze turned upward, toward the heavens, toward the endless dark of space. For there, beyond Terra's fragile light, the galaxy awaited unification. The Great Crusade was coming. And when the Emperor rose to lead humanity to the stars, the custodians would walk beside him, golden and silent, their armor gleaming like small suns amid the void. The air of Terra trembled with promise. The thunder of industry echoed from the cradle of the Imperial Palace to the poisoned seas far below. The wars of unification were over. Humanity's homeworld, once fractured and bleeding, now lay beneath the single golden banner of the Master of Mankind. For the first time in countless ages, there was peace upon Terra. But peace was never his destination, only a beginning. The Emperor gazed toward the stars, and in his mind, he saw the truth, that humanity had not perished among the void, but had scattered, spread like dust upon the solar winds during the long age of strife. Across the galaxy, human worlds still burned, fought, and decayed. The Emperor's dream was not of a single world, but of all worlds, united, enlightened, and eternal. And when he rose from his throne and spoke of this destiny, the custodians gathered at his feet, 10,000 golden figures, silent and still, their armor shimmering in the radiance of the palace lights. They did not ask questions, nor cheer, nor kneel, for they had already given their answer long ago. They would follow him, as they always had, to the stars, to the end of time. The sky above the Himalayan mountains burned bright as the first Imperial warships ascended. Vast vessels of gleaming adamantium, the earliest of what would become the great expeditionary fleets, tore through the clouds. They were not yet the sprawling, Baroque cathedral ships of later millennia. These were sleek, pristine instruments of purpose. Each bore upon its hull the sigil of the Aquila, the Emperor's two-headed eagle, gazing both forward and back, a symbol of vigilance eternal. And among the crews, among the mortal soldiers and nascent Astartes formations, there walked the Emperor's finest, the Adeptus Custodes. They moved like living flame, their presence transforming the very air around them. Where they stood, fear faltered. Where they marched, order followed. For though there were armies beyond number, fleets beyond measure, it was they who carried the Emperor's personal light into the void. At their head strode Constantine Valdor, his golden armor chased with inlays of silver, his guardian spear resting lightly in one hand. He was not merely a commander, he was the bridge between God and man. He did not shout orders, his warriors needed none. Each custodian knew their place, their role, their destiny, as though the Emperor himself whispered it into their souls. The first destination was Luna, the moon of terror. Once a stronghold of rogue gene cults and forbidden tech priests, it had defied the Emperor's rule even as the rest of the solar system bent the knee. It was there that the first blood of the Great Crusade was spilled. The custodians descended upon Luna like living comets, gold-clad shapes cutting through the thin atmosphere on grav wings, their weapons blazing in the pale light. The resistance of the Lunan gene rites was formidable. Legions of vat-born soldiers, twisted by science, gone mad. But they were no match for the Emperor's chosen. The custodians did not fight as men. They moved as a symphony. Every strike, every thrust of the guardian spear, every bolt discharge was in perfect harmony. 100 golden warriors advanced as one living being, each anticipating the movements of the others. Where the thunder warriors of old had triumphed through brute force, the custodians triumphed through perfection. In mere hours, the lunar strongholds fell silent. The gene cults were pacified, their forges seized, their surviving adepts brought before the Emperor. He did not destroy them, he repurposed them. From their knowledge, the foundations of the Mechanicum alliance would grow, binding Mars and Terra together in the coming years. And thus, Luna became the first world reclaimed beneath the Emperor's light. The custodians stood upon its ashen plains as the Emperor gazed upward, toward the sun, toward Mars, toward the infinite beyond. From there, the solar conquest began. The planets of Mercury and Venus, long dead or boiling with poisonous atmosphere, were cleared of ancient debris. Mars, the red world of the machine cult, bowed to Terra in solemn treaty. The Mechanicum swore fealty to the Emperor, and in return, he granted them his protection and the right to continue their sacred work. The Treaty of Mars was signed in the presence of the custodians themselves. Their golden armor reflected the crimson sands of the Martian surface as they stood behind their Emperor, silent witnesses to a pact that would shape the galaxy for millennia. Even the tech priests of Mars, who worship machines as divine, found themselves in awe. In the custodians, they saw a purity of design no machine could match, flesh as perfect as any crafted mechanism. They called them the Omnissiah's miracles, though none dared speak it aloud. Soon, the Great Crusade stretched beyond the solar system. Humanity's scattered colonies awaited reconnection, some still human, some twisted by the warp, some fallen into savagery. The Emperor's fleets surged outward, carrying banners of gold and flame. And always, where the Emperor went, the custodians followed. They walked at his side upon the bridges of battle barges, their golden armor gleaming in the light of distant suns. They strode through the dust of alien worlds, their steps leaving marks that would never fade. To them, the crusade was not conquest, it was pilgrimage. Each planet reclaimed was a prayer fulfilled. each victory a step closer to the divine design. When the first Space Marine legions were born, the Custodians observed them with silent curiosity. The Astartes were many, disciplined and strong, but to the 10,000, they were still children, crude echoes of a more refined template. The Custodians respected their purpose, but never their equality. A Custodian could command 1,000 Space Marines, or stand alone against 10,000 foes, and prevail. Yet they were not arrogant, they simply were. They carried within them the quiet certainty of beings who had seen the face of their God and lived. Thus, the galaxy began to awaken. The Emperor's fleets lit the void with trails of light, and humanity's ancient empire began to take form once more. On countless worlds, statues of gold were raised depicting the Emperor and his companions, immortal guardians of a reborn mankind. And as the stars slowly turned, the Custodians continued their march, not for glory, not for conquest, but for the Emperor himself. Where he walked, they walked. Where he stood, they stood. And wherever he would go, they would follow, forever. The galaxy burned with the light of rebirth. From the smoldering ruins of the age of strife, the Emperor's banners rose upon 1,000 worlds. The Great Crusade swept outward like a golden tide, uniting, cleansing, restoring. Yet amid all this thunder of conquest, there were moments, quiet, sacred moments, where war gave way to stillness. And in those moments, the Custodians walked not as warriors, but as companions. They were ever close to the Emperor. To some, this was honor beyond measure. To them, it was duty beyond self. They were his shadow and his echo, moving where he moved, standing where he stood. When he spoke to mortal kings or alien lords, they were there, silent, unblinking, the weight of their presence alone enough to still entire halls. They were the first and last to see him each day. They guarded his chambers as he slept, his throne as he planned, and his path as he strode through battlefields. None but they and a chosen few of the Mechanicum could come so near to his presence unbidden. They did not call him Lord nor Master. They had a single name for him, Father, and though they spoke it rarely, it carried a reverence that no choir could match. The Custodians learned more than war in their service. They learned the Emperor's ways, his patience, his vast understanding of humanity, his silence when lesser beings might rage. For he was not a god then, not in his own eyes. He was a guide, a maker of order, a light of reason amid the madness of superstition. When he spoke to planetary rulers, he did not demand worship, he demanded obedience to truth. And when he looked to his Custodians, it was as to mirrors of that truth, flawless, tireless, beyond reproach. Thus, many of the Custodians became more than guards. They were emissaries and judges, philosophers and envoys. When the Emperor could not be everywhere, his companions went in his stead, their word bearing the same weight as his own decree. Whole worlds were brought into compliance by the mere arrival of one golden warrior, his voice calm, his gaze unyielding. The people of those worlds would fall to their knees, not out of fear, but awe. To see a Custodian was to glimpse the Emperor's perfection embodied. But not all duties were so grand. Some Custodians stood silent in the Imperial Palace as the new bureaucracy of empire began to take form, a vast engine of governance that would one day become the Adeptus Terra, the great administrative machine of mankind. The Custodians did not rule, they observed. They watched as mortal functionaries, generals, and remembrancers tried to make sense of the Emperor's vision. And though they rarely spoke, when they did, their words carried finality. For to contradict a custodian was to stand against the emperor himself. Among them, the most trusted were known as the companions of the throne, those who never left his side. Each companion was more than a bodyguard. They were confidants, witnesses to the emperor's most secret counsels and silent meditations. They bore the weight of his solitude, for though he was surrounded by billions, he was alone, and they alone could understand the measure of that burden. It is said that the emperor's presence was overwhelming, that even Primarchs, his mighty sons, found their souls shaken when he fixed his gaze upon them. But the custodians endured it daily. They were shaped to withstand that brilliance, to see the light of divinity and not be blinded. Some described it as standing before a star and feeling warmth, not fire, for the custodians were made to belong within that radiance. There are quiet records, whispers in the hidden archives of terror, of moments when the emperor spoke to his companions, not as soldiers, but as equals in thought. He would ask questions, not of tactics, but of meaning. "Tell me," he once said, "if mankind achieves peace everlasting, what then will become of those who live only to God?" And in the silence that followed, a custodian named Ra-Endymion replied, "Then, Father, we shall guard peace itself." The emperor had smiled, faintly, briefly, before turning back to his work. Such moments were rare, but they bound the custodians to him in a way that even the Primarchs could not comprehend. They were not his sons by creation alone. They were the keepers of his presence, the fragments of his will made flesh. As the Great Crusade spread outward, the custodians' roles multiplied. Some remained with the emperor, walking beside him on the worlds of compliance. Others were dispatched ahead of his coming to prepare the way. A custodian arriving on a world often meant one of two things: salvation or extinction. Their armor gleamed like the dawn as they descended from the skies, and their words carried the weight of the emperor's voice. "Humanity is one. You will join the Imperium. Resistance is folly." Few resisted. Those who did vanished beneath the perfect silence of gold. Yet for all their splendor, the custodians remained few, never more than 10,000. Each new warrior took years to craft, and each was irreplaceable. But to the emperor, this was as it should be. He needed not armies without number. He needed exemplars, living proof of what humanity could become when guided by his hand. And so, even as the newly rediscovered Primarchs began to lead their Space Marine legions into the stars, the custodians continued to stand apart. They were the emperors, and his alone. While the Primarchs were commanders, conquerors, and gods of war, the custodians were guardians of a dream greater than any battle. They walked among demigods and mortals alike without pride or envy, for they had no need. They had already stood at the center of perfection and found their place within it. The Great Crusade surged onward, countless worlds reclaimed, countless banners raised. But amid that eternal motion, the custodians remained still, constant as the Emperor's own light. For theirs was not the glory of victory, but the quiet, infinite duty of preservation, to stand between the Emperor and all harm, to be the wall that no darkness could breach. Beneath the imperial palace, far below the marble floors and golden spires, there existed a world unseen by mortal eyes, a labyrinth of tunnels, vaults, and cyclopean chambers that stretched downward for miles, deeper than the roots of mountains. This was no mere foundation. It was a hidden empire unto itself, humming with machinery, glowing with psychic wards, and trembling with the pulse of the Emperor's greatest work. It was called the Webway Project, the dream of an age that never was. To understand its purpose, one must first understand the peril that haunted mankind even in its triumph. The warp, that formless, roiling dimension of emotion and madness, was both mankind's greatest tool and its eternal curse. Through it, ships could travel faster than light, their navigators steering through its shifting tides. But the warp was also home to darker things, the entities of chaos, ancient and malevolent, born from the souls of the living. Every psychic thought, every emotion of rage or fear gave them strength. And as humanity expanded, so too did those unseen horrors. The Emperor knew this truth. He had known it since before the dawn of civilization. He had seen what the warp could become, and he refused to let it claim his species. And so, he devised the Webway Project. Long before mankind's rise, another race, the Aeldari, had mastered the art of safe travel through the Imperium. They built a vast network of tunnels through the warp, shielded from its madness, a serene highway of light and thought. This network was called the Webway. The Emperor sought to create his own entrance into it, allowing humanity to traverse the stars without ever touching the cursed sea of the warp again. Imagine it, a galaxy where ships would glide through stable tunnels of energy, never at risk from demons or storms, a utopia of safety and order. To most of the Imperium, this secret was unknown. To the custodians, it was everything. For while the legions fought across the stars, the custodians waged their war beneath the very soil of terror. The construction of the Imperial Webway was a monumental endeavor. Thousands of mechanicum magi worked day and night, guided by the Emperor's psychic presence. Entire cathedrals of technology were raised in silence beneath the palace, filled with glowing pylons and shimmering gateways. The Emperor himself spent long stretches of time within these depths. His mind stretched between matter and the immaterium, forcing the impossible into being. The custodians stood, sentinel, at every gate, every chamber, every shimmering corridor. None entered or left without their sanction, for this was no mere construction site. It was a battlefield unseen. At first, the project was stable. The first gate opened successfully, a portal of pure light connecting the palace's deepest vaults to the outskirts of the ancient Aeldari Webway. Through it shimmered infinite potential, a bridge to the Emperor's dream. But then came the breach. It began as a whisper in the warp, a ripple of unease that brushed against the Emperor's psychic senses. Somewhere deep within the newly forged tunnels, something stirred. The barrier between real space and the warp, so carefully shaped, buckled. And from that crack poured madness. Demons, creatures of pure hate and hunger, given form by the warp's formless tides. They flooded into the tunnels like a living storm, tearing through the shining holes, twisting machinery and flesh alike. The custodians were the first to respond. In perfect silence, the alarms rose. The Emperor's companions donned their war plate, their helms sealing with the hiss of sanctified air. Golden blades ignited, and bolt of fire echoed through the depths like thunder. The war in the Webway had begun. It was unlike any war the Imperium had known. No sunlit battlefields, no roaring legions, only the dim glow of collapsing tunnels and the shrieks of demons echoing in psychic darkness. The custodians fought in endless corridors that shifted and folded in impossible geometries. Every step forward could lead a warrior into another layer of reality or back into his own shadow. Yet they did not falter. They fought in disciplined silence, each strike measured, each formation perfect. Their guardian spears burned with cleansing fire. Their storm shields shimmered with auric light. For every demon they slew, two more surged forward, howling through the warp's slick dark. But the custodians held. They had to. Behind them stood the Emperor. Behind him, terror. Behind terror, all of mankind. The Emperor himself joined the battle, his psychic radiance searing through the shadows. Every gesture of his hand banished nightmares to dust. Yet even his power could not be everywhere at once. The breach grew, the daemonic hordes multiplying, their claws scraping at the edges of the physical world. The custodians held the line for years. Down there, time lost all meaning. Some said they fought entire lifetimes in those endless halls, their souls burning ever brighter against the dark. Above, the Imperium continued unaware. The Great Crusade marched on, led by the Primarchs and their legions. Victories were declared. Statues were raised. None knew that beneath the palace, the Emperor's golden guardians fought an invisible war for humanity's very soul. Eventually, the breach could no longer be contained. The Emperor made a choice that broke his own heart. He sealed the Imperial webway entirely. The grand dream of safe passage through the stars was lost. The portals were locked behind psychic wards so strong that even demons could not pierce them. The cost was enormous. Thousands of custodians fell, their bodies interred within the silent crypts deep beneath the palace. Some still stand there, sealed in stasis, their armor frozen mid-battle, eternal sentinels over the sealed gates of the webway. The Emperor returned to his throne, weary and wounded in spirit. He had glimpsed what could have been a human empire free from the corruption of chaos, and watched it crumble into ruin by the fickle nature of the warp. The custodians said nothing. They simply took up their positions again, silent as ever, their golden armor dimmed but unbroken. They would not speak of that war. They would not need to. The Emperor's dream had failed, but their duty had not. They had guarded him through his greatest trial, and though the tunnels below still whispered with unseen horrors, terror endured. And so the custodians stood upon the marble floors of the palace once more. Above them, the stars. Below them, a prison of nightmares. And between the two, they stood eternal. For 2 centuries, the Great Crusade burned like a star across the galaxy. World by world, system by system, humanity was reunited under the Emperor's light. The legions of the Adeptus Custodes, the Space Marines, carried his will to the stars, led by his 20 demigod sons, the Primarchs. Each Primarch was a reflection of a different aspect of the Emperor. His will, his courage, his intellect, his fury. The galaxy trembled before their combined glory, and for a time, it seemed that nothing could stand against mankind's ascension. But perfection is fragile, and beneath the golden surface of empire, darkness began to stir. The custodians felt it first. They did not sense treachery, not yet, but unease. In their silent vigils beside the Emperor, they saw the growing weight upon his shoulders. The Emperor had withdrawn more and more from the crusade, leaving its command to his favored son, Horus Lupercal, the War Master. Horus, the brightest, most beloved of the Primarchs, was everything his father had hoped for. Charismatic, brilliant, beloved by his brothers, and adored by the legions. To the custodians, Horus was second only to the Emperor himself in the majesty of his bearing. Yet even they, perfect as they were, could not see what was to come. For in the cold void beyond the Emperor's sight, chaos waited, patient, whispering, and hungry. It began upon a distant world called Davin. There, Horus fell, wounded by a cursed blade, poisoned not by venom, but by faith. The dark gods of the warp, those ancient entities who had watched humanity rise and despised it for its potential, saw their chance. They reached into the War Master's mind and filled it with visions of betrayal. They showed him a galaxy where the Emperor was no savior, but a tyrant, a false god who sought to enslave mankind's spirit beneath the chains of order. And Horus believed the Emperor's son, his greatest creation, turned his face from the light. When the custodians learned of the War Master's rebellion, it was already too late. Worlds burned in the name of the Emperor and in the name of Horus. Brother fought brother. Entire legions fell to darkness. The galaxy that had once sung with unity now screamed in civil war. On Terra, the Emperor did not rage. He did not curse. He simply commanded. Prepare the palace. Call the 10,000 to arms. For 10,000 years, the custodians had been watchers, guardians of peace. Now, for the first time since the Unification Wars, they marched to war as a legion. The marble floors of the Imperial Palace shook with their tread. Thousands of artisans, scribes, and remembrances fled the halls as the golden warriors assembled in perfect ranks. Their armor was polished to mirror brightness, their weapons sanctified in the light of the Emperor's presence. They spoke no vows aloud, for they needed none. Duty was its own prayer. Constantine Valdor stood before them, his voice calm as the storm gathered beyond the stars. Brothers of the throne, he said, we have stood in silence for too long. Now the storm breaks and the Father calls. The traitor comes. Let us remind the galaxy what gold truly means. And the 10,000 bowed their heads in unison. Horus came for Terra. His rebel fleet blackened the skies. Millions of traitor Astartes, corrupted by the warp, poured towards the cradle of mankind. Titans strode across the plains, their footsteps like earthquakes. Demons screamed through the void, clawing at the edges of reality. It was the greatest siege in the history of the galaxy, the siege of Terra. And at its heart stood the custodians, the last and brightest guardians of the Emperor himself. They fought not for victory, for they knew this war would wound eternity, but to buy their father the time he needed. For while his sons tore the galaxy apart, the Emperor worked still upon the golden throne, fighting in unseen realms to hold back the warp itself. The custodians stood beside the Imperial fists, those stalwart defenders, led by Rogel Dawn, and beside the Sisters of Silence, the psychic gnolls, whose presence alone could weaken demons. Together, they formed the walls of gold and steel that would hold against the War Master's onslaught. In the shadows of the palace, custodian strike teams moved with silent precision, eliminating infiltrators and rooting out corruption. No whisper of treason could escape their notice. Each custodian was worth 100 space marines, and in those days each fought as though the Emperor himself watched through their eyes. And in truth, perhaps he did. When Horus's armadas finally reached Terra, the sky became fire. Orbiting ships blazed like dying suns. Planetary shields crackled and faltered. The sound of bombardment was endless, a ceaseless hammering upon the world's heart. And through it all, the custodians stood, upon the walls, at the gates, within the throne halls, unmoving, unafraid. They did not curse the traitors. They did not cry for vengeance. They simply fought, each blow a prayer, each death a promise. They were more than soldiers now. They were symbols. The unbreakable will of humanity made flesh. But even symbols can bleed. The custodians suffered terrible losses. Each golden warrior who fell was irreplaceable, a masterpiece extinguished. Some fought until their armor cracked and their weapons ran dry, then fought still with their bare hands. Their blood stained the marble of the palace, mixing with the dust of shattered empires. Yet not one of them turned away. Not one fled, not one broke. As the walls of Terra burned and the Emperor's own suns clashed in madness above, the custodians held their line. They had been born to protect him, and now they would do so until the last light of Terra flickered out. For beyond all glory, beyond all war, their oath remained. We are his shield. We are his sword. We are the wall that will not fall. The skies above Terra were no longer skies. They were oceans of fire. From horizon to horizon, the heavens burned with the ruin of starships, loyalist and traitor alike, their shattered hulls tumbling through the void like dying suns. The light of the bombardment turned night into ceaseless dawn, a cruel mockery of the Emperor's once golden dream. Upon the plains of the Imperial Palace, the ground itself trembled. The siege of Terra had begun. The custodians stood upon the Eternity Gate, the last and greatest portal between the outer walls and the sanctum where the Emperor labored upon the golden throne. The gate's adamantine bulk towered higher than mountains, engraved with the names of every world humanity had ever conquered. Behind it lay the beating heart of the Imperium. Before it, the storm. The legions of Horus had come in their billions, a tide of heretics, mutants, and traitor marines. Titans strode among them like steel gods, and demons clawed through the fabric of reality, summoned by dark rites. The air itself was poison and ash. But against that apocalypse stood the Emperor's 10,000, the Adeptus Custodes, gold against the darkness. Each custodian's armor gleamed faintly even through the smoke, its auric plates reflecting the burning sky. They stood in silence. They had no need for speeches, no need for fear. Among them, Constantin Valdor walked, his guardian spear held low, his expression calm as ever. The soldiers around him, imperial fists, sisters of silence, even mortal auxilia, took strength from that calm. It was said that when Valdor looked upon you, the storm within your heart stilled. Hold, he said simply. We are the throne's edge. We do not break. The first assault came like thunder. Artillery fire screamed from orbit, shattering the outer walls. Waves of traitor marines surged forward, the sons of Horus, once noble, now monstrous, their armor defiled with symbols of chaos. Behind them came the hordes of corrupted mortals, chanting Horus's name like a curse. The custodians met them at the breach. Golden light clashed with shadow as guardian spears struck, bolters roared, and blades of Auramite cut through heretical flesh. The ground was soon carpeted with corpses, but the custodians fought on, tireless, unstoppable. Where one fell, another stepped forward, as if their very ranks were woven from the Emperor's own will. At the walls, sisters of silence moved among them, the psychic gnolls, silent and terrible. Their very presence stifled the warp's howling voices, dimming the demon's strength. Side by side, gold and grey fought together, perfect unity of purpose. The days of battle blurred together, each one darker than the last. The palace's outer defenses fell, then its inner courtyards. The custodians withdrew slowly, fighting for every corridor, every stair, every inch of ground. The once pristine halls of the Imperial Palace, marble, gold, and light, became charnel houses. The statues of saints and heroes cracked beneath the weight of bombardment. Fire raged through the gardens of remembrance, and through it all, the custodians never broke formation. They became legend in those days, golden phantoms moving through smoke, unyielding, unbroken. The traitors whispered their dread among themselves, that the Emperor's chosen could not die as men did, that they would rise again if struck down, forged anew from their own ashes. It wasn't true, but it felt true. And that was enough. Within the heart of the palace, the Emperor continued his great labor upon the golden throne, battling the warp itself, striving to hold the veil between realities from tearing completely. The custodians felt his presence in their souls, a steady pulse, a divine rhythm that urged them onward even as the walls shook around them. Many of them died without seeing him again, but they did not need to. Faith, not blind belief, but perfect understanding, burned within their hearts. Each custodian knew, even if the world burned to ash, the Emperor must endure. For if he fell, all of mankind would fall with him. The traitor Primarchs came in person. Fulgrim, the twisted angel of excess. Angron, the red beast of slaughter. Mortarion, the lord of decay. They brought with them nightmares made flesh, yet even they could not breach the eternity gate. Time and again they hurled their armies forward. Time and again they broke upon that unyielding wall of gold. The custodians stood with the imperial fists, shoulder to shoulder, each knowing that the next charge might be their last, but refusing to take a single step back. One account, recorded in the Chronicles of Valdor, tells of a custodian named Alephron. When the gate's hinges cracked beneath the bombardment, he stood before it, holding the breach alone. His spear shattered, his armor in flames. He fought until his heart stopped beating, and even then, his body stood upright, a golden statue of defiance. When dawn broke, the breach was still sealed, and the traders called him the wall that would not fall. But dawn on Terra was no longer dawn. The skies were blackened by war, the sun choked by ash and orbital fire. The air was poison. Every breath was agony. The sound of battle was unending. Thunder without pause, a chorus of death. The custodians did not sleep. They did not eat. They simply fought, hour after hour, day after day. The numbers thinned. Gold dimmed beneath blood. The 10,000 became the 1,000, then hundreds. Still they fought, and then silence. A great stillness fell over the battlefield. Even the warp seemed to hush. The custodians, drenched in blood and soot, looked up to see the source. Above Terra's scarred skies, a single ship loomed, the Vengeful Spirit, Horus's flagship. The War Master had come in person, and upon the throne, the Emperor rose at last. He had waited long enough. The time had come for the final reckoning. The sky above Terra was black, not with night, for there was no night anymore, but with ruin. Flames drifted like falling stars across the heavens, the wreckage of starships burning as they fell through the atmosphere. The palace lay broken and battered, its spires shattered, its marble halls reduced to labyrinths of rubble and ash. And upon the walls, the custodians still stood, silent, bloodied, unwavering. They had given everything. They were everything that remained of the Emperor's glory. And yet, even their perfection could not hold back eternity. A tremor passed through the air. Every psychic soul on Terra felt it, a pulse of dark energy so vast it eclipsed thought. The Vengeful Spirit, Horus's flagship, hung low above the planet, its blackened hull wreathed in the storms of the warp. From its core, power flowed, unnatural, hungry, alive. The Emperor paused in his labors upon the golden throne. He felt his son's challenge, a summons born of pride, despair, and love twisted into hatred. For years, he had sought to end the war through reason, to bring Horus back into the light. But now, reason had burned away. Now, only destiny remained. The Emperor turned to his custodians, the few who yet survived, and gave his final command. He must be stopped, no matter the cost. Constantin Valdor bowed low before him, his armor scorched and his golden spear fractured. He did not argue. He did not plead to join the Emperor in battle, for he knew none but the Father could face the Son. The Emperor stepped toward the teleportation dais. His robes were torn, his armor blackened, his eyes, those eternal eyes that had once held galaxies within them, now burned like dying suns. As he vanished in a flash of blinding light, the custodians knelt, and though they did not pray, every one of them whispered the same silent thought: "Bring him home, my lord." The Emperor appeared upon the vengeful spirit. It was no longer a ship. It was a nightmare, a cathedral of rust and shadow, twisted by the power of the warp. Flesh and metal had fused into obscene shapes. Corridors writhed like living things. The air itself screamed, and at its heart, upon a throne of blood and bone, sat Horus Lupercal, once the brightest of the Primarchs, now the chosen of chaos. The War Master smiled as his father appeared, his armor black and red, etched with symbols that bled light. Around him, demons whispered, their claws caressing his form like a lover's touch. "Father," Horus said softly, "you should have ruled as a god, and I would have worshipped you." The Emperor's voice was calm, filled with infinite sorrow. "I did not create gods. I created men, and now I must end you." And so began the final duel. It was not a battle of swords alone, but of souls. Their clash tore through reality, each blow shattering bulkheads, each parry warping time and space. Lightning danced through the corridors, and demons screamed as the power of creation and destruction collided. The Emperor's blade, radiant as the sun, met Horus's dark talon again and again, sparks of pure energy exploding with every strike. The echoes of their combat could be felt on Terra itself. Storms raged across continents, oceans boiled, and the warp howled in agony. It was father against son, love against hate, light against shadow, the oldest war made manifest. For all his might, the Emperor could not bring himself to destroy his son. Again and again, he struck with measured blows, seeking not to kill, but to subdue. Horus laughed, a sound like thunder cracking through the void. "Mercy?" he spat. "Even now, mercy? You are weaker than I thought." And with a roar, the War Master unleashed his full fury. The power of the Chaos Gods flowed through him, each a reflection of humanity's darkest desires: rage, greed, decay, and excess. He struck the Emperor down, shattering his armor, casting him to the floor. The galaxy trembled as the Emperor bled. For the first time, the master of mankind had fallen. Elsewhere, aboard the ship, a figure moved through the carnage, Rogel Dawn, Primarch of the Imperial Fists. He and his warriors fought their way toward the Emperor's signal, desperate to reach him. But they were far away still, and time was slipping like sand through their fingers. Back upon the bridge, Horus loomed over his father, his talon poised to strike. "Look upon your Imperium," he hissed. "See how it burns. This is your dream made real." The Emperor raised his eyes, blood upon his lips. "No," he whispered. "This is your failure." At that moment, a mortal entered the chamber, a lone Imperial soldier, broken and terrified. Perhaps it was courage or desperation or love of the Emperor that drove him forward. He raised his weapon against Horus. The War Master turned. With the flick of his hand, he reduced the man to ashes. And in that instant, in that single, unforgivable act, the Emperor saw. He saw that Horus was gone, that his son's soul had been devoured, leaving only the monster behind. And the sorrow that filled him burned away all restraint. The Emperor rose. The light that followed had no color, no shape. It was the light of truth, pure, absolute, and terrible. It seared through the ship, vaporizing demons, unmaking corruption, burning through every shadow of the warp. Horus cried out, not in pain, but in realization. For a heartbeat, the old Horus, the son, the warrior, the beloved, flickered within those corrupted eyes. Father, he whispered, and then he was gone. The Emperor unleashed his full power, obliterating the War Master's soul, erasing him utterly from existence. The Chaos Gods screamed in rage, but even they could not reach into that light. When it faded, only silence remained. Rogal Dawn arrived moments later. He found the Emperor broken, his body ruined beyond mortal comprehension. Horus was gone, not dead, but unmade. The Emperor lay upon the deck, his flesh burned, his armor shattered, his spirit barely clinging to the material realm. Dawn wept as he lifted him in his arms. The master of mankind, savior, conqueror, father, was dying. And yet, even as his body failed, his will did not. With the last of his strength, the Emperor whispered the only order that mattered. Place me upon the throne. Back on Terra, the surviving custodians watched as the Emperor's ravaged form was carried into the sanctum. They fell to their knees, not in despair, but in reverence. They understood, even without words. The Emperor's mortal body had perished, but his spirit would endure, bound forever to the golden throne, to hold back the tides of chaos and preserve mankind's fragile light. The 10,000 bowed their heads. Their god still lived, not as he once had, but as the eternal flame that would never die. And so began the age of the Imperium, an age of worship, silence, and endless vigilance. The Emperor's golden guardians would never again leave his side. For now, more than ever, humanity needed their watchful eyes. The war was over. The galaxy was silent, but it was not peace. The traitor legions had fled into the madness of the warp, pursued by the wrath of the loyalists. The skies above Terra were a graveyard of ships, their wrecks drifting like bones through a sea of fire. The Imperial Palace, once the radiant heart of mankind's unity, lay broken and scarred, its golden spires now blackened monuments to sorrow. And in its deepest chamber upon the golden throne, the Emperor sat, unmoving. They called it the Ascension, though there was nothing divine about it. The custodians were there when the Mechanicum sealed the Emperor's shattered body into the throne. They watched in silence as cables and conduits were driven into his flesh, as ancient machines hummed to life and a psychic energy, immense beyond comprehension, pulsed through the chamber. His body was ruined, but his mind, his spirit, was still there, silent, watching, enduring. The throne became his prison and his beacon both, a machine so vast that it could burn a soul forever to keep the light of humanity alive. It was said that the Emperor's last command echoed through the minds of the 10,000, protect them, protect humanity from itself. And so the custodians began their long vigil. They sealed the palace gates. No one, save the High Lords of Terra, would ever again enter the throne room unbidden. The halls, where once laughter and debate echoed, became silent sanctuaries of mourning. The 10,000 polished their armor, repaired their weapons, and took their stations, not as warriors of conquest, but as sentinels of eternity. Where once they strode across battlefields, now they patrolled corridors. Where once they stood beneath the Emperor's gaze, now they stood before his empty throne. They did not weep, they did not question, they simply were. Above them, the Imperium began to change. In the days of the Great Crusade, the Emperor had forbidden worship of himself. He had sought to bring enlightenment, reason, and unity to free mankind from the chains of superstition. But now, he was silent, and silence, in the hearts of mortals, breeds faith. Whispers began to spread through the ruined streets of Terra, that the Emperor had not died, but ascended, that he watched over his people still, that his light shone through the Astronomicon, the psychic beacon that guided humanity's ships across the stars. And so, slowly, inevitably, the Emperor became a god. The custodians watched this transformation in silence. They did not correct the priests who built temples in his name. They did not rebuke the masses who fell to their knees in worship. They knew the truth, that their master was not a god, but a man who had given everything to save his species. But they also knew that humanity needed faith now more than ever, and if that faith took the form of worship, so be it. Better to kneel before a memory of the Emperor than before the false gods of the warp. Centuries passed. The wounds of the siege healed slowly, but the Imperium that rose from the ashes was not the dream the Emperor had envisioned. It was an empire of fear, bureaucracy, and dogma. The ecclesiarchy, the new church of the God Emperor, spread across the stars, turning his name into a weapon of faith. Wars were fought in his honor, worlds burned in his name. Heretics and mutants were purged without mercy. The light of reason dimmed, replaced by the fire of zealotry. And through it all, the custodians remained silent. They withdrew deeper into the imperial palace, beyond the reach of politics and corruption. They became myths, whispered of but never seen. To most of humanity, they were little more than statues of gold, guarding a throne that no one dared approach. But the truth was far more profound. Within the palace, the custodians still trained, still watched, still listened. Their war was no longer one of blades, but of vigilance. They studied every shadow within the Imperium's heart, every whisper of treachery, every hint of corruption that might reach the throne. Some among them became agents beyond the palace, moving unseen among the stars to test the strength of humanity's soul. These were the eyes of the Emperor, silent watchers who walked unnoticed among the common folk. Others delved into philosophy and art, seeking to preserve the purity of the Emperor's original vision. For though they had been made as warriors, the custodians were also thinkers, scholars, poets, historians, and their long watch gave them time to ponder the meaning of duty, of loss, of eternity. It was said that once each century, a custodian would kneel before the golden throne and whisper, "We are still here, Father." There was never an answer, but the faint hum of the throne, the steady pulse of psychic power, was all the reply they needed. The Emperor still lived, and as long as he endured, so would they. 1,000 years passed, then another. Empires rose and fell. Wars came and went. The Imperium spread to 1,000,000 worlds, its people divided by faith and fear, yet united beneath the silent gaze of the throne. The custodians watched it all. They did not sleep. They did not age. They were living statues, the memory of a golden age that had died before it began. They were the promise of what mankind could have been, and the proof of what it had become. And so, the long vigil continued. Through the darkness of the millennia, through the endless wars and the slow decay of civilization, the Emperor's golden guardian stood as the last unbroken remnant of his dream. They did not rule, they did not preach, they simply endured, as perfect, unyielding, and sorrowful as the day they were made. They were the light that refused to go out. They were the memory of hope. They were the Adeptus Custodes, 10,000 years, 10,000 years of silence. The world beyond the walls of the Imperial Palace had become something unrecognizable, a vast empire built upon the corpse of a dream. The Imperium endured, yes, but it endured like a dying star, bright still, but fading, every flicker of its light consuming what remained of its soul. And at its heart, upon Terra, the custodians kept their eternal watch. But even immortality carries a weight. The Imperial Palace was no longer a palace. It had become a continent of stone and steel, a fortress that spanned thousands of miles, layered with walls, sanctums, and cathedrals that reached to the heavens. Entire cities had been built atop its foundations. Millions of priests, scribes, and soldiers toiled within its shadow, their lives spent in service to a god they would never see. Yet, at the very core, beyond countless sealed gates and sanctified corridors, the custodians remained. To the outside world, they were myth. To themselves, they were prisoners. Their armor gleamed still, polished by ritual. Their spears and halberds were sharp, their reflexes perfect. But the wars they had been born to fight were long gone. In the beginning, their vigil had purpose, to guard the Emperor as he battled in the warp, to protect his body from the touch of corruption. But centuries had blurred into millennia, and the rhythms of eternity dulled even their perfect minds. They trained still, sparring in the Hall of Blades, their movements as flawless as ever. But the sound of steel against steel rang hollow. They recited the litany of duty, their voices echoing in the marble halls. But each word felt heavier than the last. They watched the throne room, but the figure upon it never stirred. The Emperor's light still shone, but dimly now, flickering through the tides of the warp like a distant star seen through storm clouds. And in that flicker, doubt was born. It was not rebellion, never that. The custodians were incapable of treachery, but they began to ask themselves questions in silence, questions that no one else could ever dare voice. Was the Emperor truly still alive? Or were they guarding a corpse, a relic of an age that no longer was? And if he was alive, what did he see now? Did he see what humanity had become? Would he be proud or heartbroken? There were those among the 10,000 who refused to dwell on such thoughts. These were the purists, the stalwart few who believed unwaveringly that the Emperor's will was eternal and that duty required no understanding, only obedience. But others began to change. They were the apostolic custodians, scholars and thinkers who sought meaning beyond blind service. They studied the texts of the past, the journals of remembrances, the words of the Primarchs, even fragments of the Emperor's own edicts. They walked the abandoned galleries where murals of the Great Crusade still glowed faintly under dust. They traced the lines of forgotten maps, trying to remember the dream they had once bled for. They spoke quietly, among themselves, of how far humanity had fallen, of how the Emperor's vision of enlightenment had turned into a theocracy of fear. They did not rebel, they could not, but they mourned. Sometimes, late in the long nights of terror, when the storms outside howled against the palace walls, the custodians would wander the silent hall, where statues of their fallen brothers stood. Each statue bore a name, carved in high Gothic, gleaming faintly under the golden lamps. The air there was cold, filled with the faint hum of the throne far below. Some custodians would kneel before those statues for hours, speaking softly to the dead. Not prayers, never prayers, but confessions. "We have failed you," one might whisper. "We guard the dream, but we no longer live it." And yet, despite this quiet sorrow, their discipline never faltered. Even as the Imperium decayed, as corruption spread through the ranks of the High Lords, as worlds burned in pointless wars, as entire sectors fell to darkness, the custodians stood as they always had, unmoving, unbroken, untouched. But something within them was shifting, slowly, imperceptibly, like the turning of a great wheel beneath the sands of time. Because even perfection cannot remain still forever. It was around this time that the first whispers began to reach the palace. Whispers of the warp growing stronger. Whispers of new storms. Great rifts of corruption tearing through space. Whispers of demons walking once more among the stars. The apostolic custodians listened, and in their hearts, something stirred. Not fear, but memory. For they remembered the war in the webway, the first and greatest secret of their order. They remembered what slept beneath the palace, what doors had been sealed, and what horrors still waited behind them. If the warp was rising again, then perhaps their watch was not yet over. One night, as Terra's skies boiled with unending lightning, Captain General Trajan Valoris, the Lord of the 10,000, walked alone through the shadowed corridors of the Imperial Palace. He came to the throne room and stood before the Emperor, the golden husk that was his body, and bowed low. "Father," he said softly, "the galaxy darkens again, and we have been still too long." He raised his gaze, eyes hard as tempered steel. "If your light still burns, give us purpose once more." There was no voice in reply, but somewhere deep within the palace, the ancient wards trembled, just slightly, as though something vast and unseen had stirred in its sleep. The custodians did not yet know it, but their long isolation was ending. The galaxy was changing once more, violently, terribly, and the time of silence was drawing to a close. Soon, they would walk the stars again. Soon, their golden armor would shine in battle once more. The gilded cage had held them for 10,000 years, but the door was beginning to crack, and beyond it, destiny waited. The storm began, as all great catastrophes do, with a whisper. Across the galaxy, worlds that had endured for millennia under the Emperor's light began to flicker and fail. The Astronomicon, that blazing psychic beacon powered by the Emperor's eternal will, faltered. Ships were lost in the warp, their crews screaming into nothingness. Entire systems vanished from the star charts, swallowed by tides of unreality. The warp, that churning sea of madness, was rising again, and this time it would not be denied. On Terra, the Adeptus Custodes watched. From their towers and sanctums, they observed the unfolding calamity. Reports flowed in from the astropaths, the psychic messengers of the Imperium, each message more dire than the last. Worlds aflame, sectors collapsing, faith itself trembling. The custodians did not panic. They did not pray. They simply listened. They had heard this song before. 10,000 years ago, during the siege, when the warp first spilled into reality, and they knew what it meant. Within the Imperial Palace, the air itself trembled with tension. The High Lords of Terra argued in endless councils, their words full of fear and politics. The ecclesiarchs demanded new purges, blaming heresy for the warp's rise. The administratum clamored for control, the Inquisition for secrecy. But the custodians spoke little. They stood apart from these mortal concerns, golden and silent, their eyes turned inward, toward the golden throne. There, the hum of the Emperor's power was changing, flickering, growing weaker. For the first time in living memory, the mechanisms of the throne stuttered. Alarms sounded deep in the palace's vaults. The psychic engineers of the Adeptus Mechanicus rushed to stabilize the divine machine, chanting binary prayers as they worked. And through it all, the custodians stood watch, their hands upon their weapons, their hearts heavy with unspoken dread. For millennia, they had told themselves that the Emperor's light would never falter, that no matter how dark the galaxy became, his will would hold. But now, they were no longer sure. There were whispers among the apostolic custodians, those few who had studied ancient prophecy and forbidden history. They spoke of cracks forming not only in the warp, but beneath the palace itself, in the old sealed tunnels, in the hidden chambers of the webway. And if those seals ever broke, the demons imprisoned below Terra would rise again. The war in the webway was not over. It had only been paused. Captain General Trajan Valoris summoned the tribunes, the custodians' highest council, to the Sanctum Imperialis, a hall older than empires, its ceiling lost in shadow. There, amid flickering candlelight and the echo of ancient machinery, he spoke. "Brothers," he said, his voice deep and calm, "for 10,000 years we have waited, watched, guarded, but the galaxy burns once more. The Emperor's realm fractures, and the warp stirs beneath our feet. Our vigil was never meant to last forever. The time has come to act." The custodians listened in silence. They were beings of perfect discipline, yet in that moment, even their golden hearts stirred. To leave Terra, to walk among the stars again, it was unthinkable, but so was doing nothing while the Imperium crumbled. Valoris turned his gaze toward the distant light of the throne, faintly visible through the sanctum's high archways. "For millennia, we have guarded his body," he said. "Now, we must guard his dream." A long silence followed, and then, one by one, the custodians nodded. The decision was made. Preparations began in secret. The forges beneath the palace roared to life once more, their dormant fires reignited. Ancient weapons, untouched for 10,000 years, were drawn from vaults of gold and glass. Jet bikes were awakened from stasis, their engines whispering like sleeping beasts. The custodians' warships, sealed since the heresy, were repaired and re-sanctified, their hulls gleaming like new forged suns. The Adeptus Custodes were going to war, but the galaxy they would return to was no longer the one they remembered, where once the stars had shone with hope. Now they were dimmed by faith, turned to fanaticism, by ignorance masquerading as devotion. Every world they would visit would call them saints, angels, gods of gold, and yet they would know, painfully, quietly, that they were only men, born of science and sacrifice, sworn to serve a dream that had died long ago. Still, they would go, because that was duty, and duty was all they had left. As their ships prepared to depart, Trajan Valoris walked once more into the throne room. The Emperor sat unmoving, his body aglow with faint, flickering light. The sound of the throne filled the air like a heartbeat made of thunder. Valoris knelt before him, his voice a whisper amid the endless hum of power. Father, we go now to guard what remains of your Imperium, to remind them what it means to serve. If you still see us, guide our hands. If you no longer do, then forgive us. There was no reply, only the faint shimmer of psychic light, pulsing like breath, and to Valoris, that was enough. The custodians marched once more, down the halls of marble and gold, through gates that had not opened in 10,000 years, their banners unfurled, their steps steady and silent. The people of Terra fell to their knees as they passed, weeping, praying, reaching out to touch the hem of their cloaks. To the mortals, it was as if angels had descended, but the custodians did not look down. They did not bask in worship. They walked with purpose, not as gods, but as guardians returning to their sacred task. And as their ships rose from the surface of Terra, breaking through the storm-torn sky, the warp itself seemed to shudder. Some said they saw a light flicker upon the golden throne at that moment, a pulse brighter than it had been in centuries, as though the Emperor himself was watching his sons depart, and perhaps, for the first time in 10,000 years, he smiled. The ships of the Adeptus Custodes had slept for 10,000 years. In the cold void above Terra, they hung like monuments to a forgotten age, immense vessels of gold and onyx, their hulls inscribed with runes of protection older than memory. When they stirred, the galaxy itself seemed to hold its breath. Their engines flared to life one by one, igniting the darkness with fire as bright as newborn stars. The 10,000 were leaving Terra, and with them went the last fragment of the Emperor's first dream. The journey through the warp was not as it had been in the days of the Great Crusade. The Imperium, that realm of pure thought and madness, had grown darker, hungrier. Even through the shielding wards of their mighty ships, the custodians could feel it pressing against reality, whispering in 1,000 voices. They ignored it. Their will was iron, their souls forged for purity. No demon could tempt them, no shadow could sway their resolve. Yet even so, they felt the weight of centuries upon them, the realization that they were stepping once more into a galaxy they no longer knew. When they emerged from the warp, they beheld the Imperium, but it was not the realm they had fought to build. Where once the stars blazed with colonies of reason and progress, now there was only ruin. Whole sectors lay silent. Asteroid fields glittered where thriving worlds had once spun. The banners of the Imperial Creed flew high above every surviving planet, but their faith was born of fear, not knowledge. The Adeptus Custodes had guarded the Emperor's light, yet beyond Terra, that light had become a torch in a storm. They saw worlds where the people knelt before towering cathedrals, chanting prayers to a god who never spoke. They saw soldiers of the Astra Militarum dying by the millions in wars none could truly explain. They saw corruption eating at every level of authority, from the lowest scribe to the loftiest cardinal. And still, they said nothing. They watched, they learned, they understood. On the world of Ophelia 7, the custodians first made themselves known. The planet was a shrine world, home to the Adeptus Sororitas, the Sisters of Battle, fanatical warrior nuns who fought in the Emperor's name. When their golden ships descended from orbit, the sisters gathered in formation, their hymns echoing across the marble plains. The custodians disembarked in silence. To the sisters, they were living saints, divine beings clad in the Emperor's own light. They fell to their knees as one, their tears glinting like crystal in the sun. But the custodians did not claim godhood. They walked among them as guardians, not deities. When the Canoness of Ophelia knelt before Captain General Trajan Valoris, he lifted her gently to her feet. "Rise, daughter of the Emperor," he said. "We are not gods. We are his hands and his eyes." And for a moment, faith met truth, and both stood in awe. The custodians traveled from world to world, not as conquerors, but as witnesses. They inspected the Adeptus Custodes, the Space Marines, those once proud warriors who had become divided into countless chapters, each clinging to fragments of their Primarch's legacies. Some fought with honor still, others had fallen to arrogance, or worse. The custodians met them all, and each encounter was a mirror held up to their own past. They saw in the Astartes what might have become of themselves had they ever known pride or rage or doubt unchained. And though they said little, the Astartes felt their presence as judgment. For if the Space Marines were the Emperor's angels of death, then the custodians were his memory. Yet not all they found was despair. In the darkest corners of the Imperium, they found sparks of courage. Mortal men and women who still fought, still hoped, even knowing the odds were hopeless. Imperial guardsmen who stood their ground against horrors they could barely comprehend. Tech priests who maintained the machines of the Imperium with quiet devotion. Civilians who prayed not out of fear, but love. The custodians saw this, and though they would never admit it, something within them softened. For the Emperor had believed in humanity once, and perhaps there was still something left to believe in. Then came the Great Rift. It began without warning, a tear in the fabric of reality, vast and crimson, splitting the galaxy in two. The warp bled into real space, devouring entire star systems in fire and madness. Planets were cast into shadow, their skies filled with screaming lights. It was the birth of the Cicatrix Maledictum, the greatest storm the galaxy had ever seen. And in that moment, every custodian aboard every ship heard it, a faint cry echoing across the Imperium. It was not a voice, not truly, but they all knew it. They had heard it once before, long ago, on the walls of Terra, the Emperor calling out. The custodians acted at once. They gathered fleets. They evacuated entire worlds from the edge of the storm. They fought demons that clawed their way into real space, creatures of hatred and fire that had not walked the galaxy since the heresy. For the first time in 10,000 years, the Golden Warriors shed blood again. Their halberds burned with light. Their shields shimmered with the radiance of the Emperor's will. Where they fought, the shadows fled. Where they stood, mortals found hope. And though the galaxy burned, for a moment, the stars seemed to blaze brighter. In the midst of the chaos, word came of a miracle. Robert Guilliman, Primarch of the Ultramarines, the Emperor's son, long thought lost, had returned. The custodians received the news with measured calm. They remembered Guilliman from the days of the Great Crusade, when he had walked beside the Emperor as a statesman and general. His resurrection was no small thing. Some among the 10,000 whispered that this was the Emperor's will, a sign that the light had not yet gone out. Valoris himself said nothing, but when he looked to the stars, his golden eyes shone with something that might have been hope. And so, the Adeptus Custodes fought on, not as jailers, but as champions. The galaxy that had once been their prison had become their battlefield again. And though the night was long and the storm unending, they stood unbroken. The Emperor's will made flesh, the last light of a dying age. They were reborn not as guardians of silence, but as warriors of purpose, the 10,000 reborn. The storm of the warp still raged across the stars when the impossible happened. From the ashes of 10,000 years of silence, a figure returned. Tall, noble, his presence radiant, even amid the darkness. He was Robout Guilliman, Primarch of the Ultramarines, son of the Emperor, and once regent of the Imperium. He had been a legend, a ghost from the Age of Heroes, and now he walked again among men. When the custodians received word of his resurrection, even their perfect composure faltered. They remembered Guilliman as he had been, the architect of order, the mind that had turned the Emperor's vision into governance, the brother who had tried to hold together a collapsing dream when the heresy had torn it apart. He had fallen to treachery at the hands of Fulgrim, his brother turned demon. His body had been entombed upon Macraga, preserved in stasis for millennia. None had believed he could rise again. Yet now he did, and with his return, hope stirred, a cautious flickering flame in the hearts of even the most stoic custodian. The news spread like wildfire through the Imperium. To the ecclesiarchy, it was a miracle, proof of the Emperor's divine will. To the Inquisition, it was a mystery to be studied and feared. To the people, it was salvation. For the first time in 10,000 years, there walked a being who had known the Emperor not as a god, but as a father. Guilliman's first act upon awakening was one of silence. He looked upon the Imperium, vast, sprawling, choked with faith and bureaucracy, and wept. He saw the golden statues, the chanting priests, the blind worship of the God Emperor, and in his heart, sorrow burned like ice. "This is not what he wanted," he said softly. "This is not his dream." But even as he mourned, he understood. The galaxy was too far gone to be rebuilt in the image of reason. The Emperor's dream of enlightenment had rotted into a religion of survival, and though Guilliman despised the hypocrisy of it, he also knew it was all that kept humanity alive. So he bowed his head and swore to protect even this imperfect empire, because that was what his father would have done. When Guilliman returned to Terra, the sky of the Holy World burned crimson from the light of the Great Rift. The custodians awaited him at the gates of eternity, their golden armor gleaming in the stormlight. As he descended from his flagship, Macraga's honor, the 10,000 knelt as one, not in worship, but in reverence. For the first time in 10 millennia, a Primarch stood before them again. Captain General Trajan Valoris stepped forward, his voice a low thunder. "Welcome home, son of the Emperor. Terra remembers you." Guilliman inclined his head. He saw in them the same perfection he had once admired and the same sorrow. "You have endured long beyond duty," he said. "You have kept the flame." Valoris replied simply, "It was never ours to let die." Together, they entered the Imperial Palace. Through hall after hall of gold and shadow, Guilliman walked, past the shrines and the banners, the endless lines of priests and guards who fell to their knees at his passing. At last, he came to the golden throne. The sight froze him. There sat the Emperor, his father, not as he had remembered, but as a broken, ancient figure of divine machinery. Tubes and cables ran through his flesh, his eyes hollow yet blazing with psychic light. The hum of the throne was deafening, the pulse of its power shaking the very air. Guilliman fell to one knee. "Father," he whispered, "I have returned." There was no answer, only the endless, steady rhythm of the throne, the sound of eternity itself. And then something stirred. For a heartbeat, the light around the Emperor's form brightened, golden tendrils of psychic radiance flaring outward, brushing against Guilliman's mind, and in that instant, he felt his father's presence. It was not warm, it was not loving. It was vast, cold, and incomprehensible, like a sun that burned not for comfort, but for necessity. A voice, or something like it, echoed within his thoughts. There is no peace. There is no end. Only the work. Guilliman bowed his head, tears in his eyes. Then I will do your work, he said, until the last star dies. When he emerged from the throne room, the custodians awaited him. He looked upon them, these eternal warriors who had guarded a silent god for 10,000 years, and he saw the weight they carried. Brothers, he said, his voice steady, you have watched the Imperium decay for ages beyond reckoning. But no longer. Your watch is not ended. It has changed. The Emperor's light must burn again, not just here, but across the stars. Valorous inclined his head. Then we will walk beside you, as once we walked beside him. And in that moment, the 10,000 and the returned Primarch stood united, gold and blue, memory and hope, the past and the fragile promise of tomorrow. Together, they set to work. Guilliman reformed the High Lords of Terror, sweeping aside corruption with a will like iron. He restored discipline to the Imperium's shattered systems, rekindled order where chaos had festered. The custodians served as his honor guard, his protectors, and at times, his conscience. They spoke little, but their presence reminded him always of what the Emperor had once been. Not a god, but a man who had tried to save his species from itself. And though Guilliman often felt the weight of solitude, the knowledge that his brothers were gone, that his father was silent, he drew strength from their silent companionship. For the first time in 10,000 years, the Imperium had a leader who could speak. And though the darkness still closed in, the light of the Emperor's will, through his sons, through his golden guardians, began to blaze anew. The galaxy was bleeding. The great rift, the cicatrix maledictum, had torn the heavens in two. One half of the Imperium lay within light, the other drowned in shadow. 500,000 worlds cried out for salvation, their voices lost amid the roar of the warp. And yet, amid that cosmic despair, a light moved, a single, unwavering beacon of purpose. It was the Adeptus Crusade, the greatest mobilization of imperial might since the days of the Great Crusade itself. And at its heart stood the Adeptus Custodes. In the void beyond Terra, fleets gathered in their thousands. Colossal warships, cathedral-like in scale, drifted in disciplined formation, each one bearing the banners of a dozen imperial forces. The Adeptus Custodes, reborn in legions of new warriors, the Imperial Navy, the zealous armies of the Astra Militarum, all assembled under a single will, the will of Robert Guilliman. But among them, gleaming brighter than all others, were the ships of gold, the vessels of the 10,000. Their hulls were flawless mirrors of the Emperor's glory, their weapons ancient beyond memory. Each custodian aboard those ships stood like a pillar of divine certainty, calm, silent, absolute. They had waited 10 millennia for purpose, and now it had come. The crusade moved like a tide of light through a sea of darkness. Its purpose was not conquest, but reclamation, to bring back the worlds swallowed by the storm, to restore faith where only terror remained. Every world they approached bore the mark of catastrophe. Some were silent, their populations devoured by the warp. Others burned, their skies filled with shrieking demons or the endless echo of prayer. But some, fragile, trembling, still held out. On those worlds, The arrival of the Golden Fleets was like the dawning of a new sun. The people would emerge from the ruins blinded by the light of engines descending through smoke. They would kneel in wonder as the custodians strode forth, silent as statues, their armor gleaming with reflected fire. To them, it was not war, it was revelation. The custodians fought not for territory nor glory, but stability, a concept that had become almost mythic. Their campaigns were swift, precise, and absolute. Where others fought with armies, they struck with precision, a handful of warriors descending like judgment upon the corrupted and the damned. Entire heresies fell in hours. Demonic incursions were banished with surgical fury. Rebellions crumbled before the mere sight of their golden ranks. And as they fought, their legend grew. To mortals, they seemed immortal, untouchable, divine. But in truth, the custodians carried no joy in battle. Each victory was a burden, each conquest a memory of how far humanity had fallen. They did not fight to inspire faith. They fought to preserve what little was left of reason. As the crusade pushed deeper into the stars, the custodians began to see the true extent of the Imperium's decay. There were worlds that worshipped the Emperor so fiercely, they had forgotten the purpose of their own existence. Others that had turned his name into justification for cruelty, tyranny, or madness. Even among the faithful, there was corruption. The administratum's bureaucracy strangled entire systems. The ecclesiarchy's dogma drowned truth beneath ritual. To the custodians, it was like walking through the ruins of their own memories. The Imperium had become a ghost of the empire they once helped build, its heart still beating, but its soul long since scarred. And yet, despite the sorrow, there was something else, a quiet pride. For amid the endless suffering, humanity endured. Mortal soldiers still held the line against horrors beyond comprehension. Pilgrims still prayed, not for power, but for courage. Children still laughed beneath skies torn by war. The custodians, who had once believed humanity lost, began to see again what their emperor had once seen, not perfection, but persistence. The indomitable spark of survival that even the warp could not extinguish. The crusade burned onward for centuries. World by world, system by system, the light of order was rekindled. Guilliman's leadership was tireless, strategic, measured, and merciless when needed. He restored the shattered Astronomicon, rebuilt communication across the stars, and reforged the broken bonds between the scattered worlds of man. And through it all, the custodians remained his shadow. They fought beside him, protected him, and, in their silent way, studied him. For Guilliman was both man and myth, and even they could see the toll of leadership upon him. He was not like the Emperor, not infinite, not divine. He was mortal still, for all his power, and perhaps that was why they followed him so willingly. He reminded them that the Emperor's dream had not been one of gods and angels, but of men and hope. As the years turned to decades, the Great Rift still raged, a wound that could never fully heal. But within its shadow, humanity survived. The Indominus Crusade had not won peace, it had ensured endurance, and in a galaxy where survival itself was victory, that was enough. When the fleets finally withdrew, the custodians returned once more to Terra, but they did not seal the palace gates as they once had. They had changed. The galaxy had changed. Now, the Adeptus Custodes walked among mankind once more. They no longer stood apart as idols of gold, but as watchers, mentors, and when needed, executioners of divine will. They would still guard the Emperor's throne, but their gaze would now reach far beyond it, to the stars, to the Imperium, to the fragile flame of humanity that still refused to die. They were no longer prisoners of eternity, they were its stewards. And though the night of the galaxy was deep and unending, their light, the Emperor's light, burned still. And so the crusade ended, but the vigil did not. For there can be no end to vigilance. In a universe forever at war, the 10,000 had returned to the stars, and with them the Emperor's shadow walked again among men. They would not conquer, nor rule, nor command. They would simply endure, as they always had, until the last dawn of mankind's story. The Indomitus Crusade had rekindled the Imperium's strength, but strength, in the grim darkness of the far future, is never unchallenged. For every world reclaimed, a dozen others teetered on the brink of ruin. For every victory in the light, shadows deepened elsewhere, and nowhere were those shadows darker than beneath the imperial palace itself. The custodians had returned home to Terra, to their sacred duty, to the golden throne, to the emperor who sat eternal. Yet the palace no longer felt as it once had. In ages past, it had been a fortress of brilliance, a citadel of light and law. Now, it was a labyrinth of silence, haunted by the whispers of 10,000 years. The walls hummed with the faint vibrations of ancient machinery. The very air trembled with psychic resonance, as though the stones themselves remembered every prayer, every scream, every death that had occurred within. To outsiders, it was holy ground. To the custodians, it was a tomb that never slept. As the 10,000 resumed their eternal watch, strange occurrences began to stir within the depths of the palace. Whispers in the lower vaults, shadows where light should not fall. Readings from Mechanicus augurs that spoke of power, signatures long thought dormant. The custodians did not dismiss these signs, for they knew what lay beneath. Deep below the imperial palace, far beneath the throne and the cathedrals, lay a place older than the Imperium itself, a hidden labyrinth, the sealed tunnels of the webway, remnants of the Emperor's greatest and most terrible experiment. It was here, 10,000 years ago, that the Emperor had waged his secret war against the warp. And though that war had been won, the victory had never been complete. Something still lingered there, something ancient, something waiting. The custodians descended. Their golden armor was dimmed with wards of shadow, their halberds aglow with faint fields of psychic light. They moved through corridors untouched by mortals for millennia, their footsteps echoing off walls of gold and bone. The deeper they went, the colder it became. Not the chill of air, but the chill of presence, a stillness that pressed against their minds. There were bones here, not human, not entirely. Fossilized remains of the warp-born things that had once clawed their way into the palace during the war in the webway. Their shapes were unspeakable, the remnants of nightmares turned to stone. And as the custodians passed, those remnants seemed to stir, not truly alive, but aware. At the lowest level of the vaults, they found the first breach, a fracture, small, precise, but unmistakable, carved into the walls of the Emperor's own wards. It shimmered faintly, like heat haze, pulsing with a heartbeat not its own. The air tasted of iron and whispers. The custodians knew what it meant. For 10,000 years they had maintained the seals. They had chanted the wards. They had believed the Webway War was buried forever. But time erodes all things, even the will of gods. Something beneath Terra was stirring again. The custodians did not speak of this to the High Lords, nor even to the ecclesiarchy. Such matters were not for mortals. In secret, they sealed the breach, layer upon layer of psychic barrier, while the Sisters of Silence, the Emperor's null maidens whose presence banished the warp, were summoned from their hidden sanctuaries. Together, they rebuilt the wards. But even as they worked, they felt the pressure on the other side. A vast, unfathomable force testing the walls between reality and nightmare. It was not a mind, nor a demon, nor any creature known. It was hunger. It was remembrance, the echo of the ancient war. For weeks, the custodians labored in silence. No records were kept, no witnesses allowed. Those who served in the lower levels of the palace were quietly reassigned, their memories washed away by the Ordo Custodes. The breach was erased from history as though it had never been. But among the 10,000, unease lingered. They had always believed themselves perfect, their vigilance absolute. And yet, beneath their feet, corruption had whispered unnoticed for centuries. If such a flaw could fester here, within the holiest place in existence, what hope could there be for the rest of the galaxy? In the quiet that followed, the custodians returned to their duties. But the silence felt different now, heavier, more aware. When they stood in the throne room, they could feel the faint hum of the golden throne in their bones, a sound that had always been constant, steady. But now, it seemed to falter ever so slightly, a single heartbeat out of rhythm, a breath that came too slow. The Emperor still lived, that they knew beyond doubt, but even a god, bound to the edge of existence, could not fight forever. And so, the custodians began to change once more. Some among them, the shield captains of the watchers below, took permanent station within the depths, their golden armor dimmed and sealed with runes. They became wardens of the unseen war, guardians of the prison beneath the palace. Others turned their gaze outward, redoubling their efforts to hunt corruption wherever it might arise. For if the warp was awakening below Terra, then surely it stirred elsewhere as well. They began to walk again among the stars, quiet and unannounced, testing the faith and resolve of imperial worlds. To the Imperium, they were myths, reborn. To themselves, they were confessors in a galaxy of sin. And yet, amid all this quiet dread, the custodians did not despair. They had faced the fall of gods, the betrayal of brothers, the silence of eternity. They had watched the galaxy die 1,000 times, and still stood unbroken. If the shadows beneath the throne stirred once more, then so be it. The Adeptus Custodes would meet them, as they always had, with unwavering light. For though the Emperor's body might fade, though the warp might roar and the stars themselves burn away, the 10,000 would remain, unmoving, unyielding, unending. The shadow beneath the throne might whisper, but above it, the light still burned. And in that light stood the Golden Guardians, the last promise of mankind's defiance. Long before the age of the Imperium, before the first Astartes had ever drawn breath, there had been another order, an order without voice, without praise, without name in the songs of men. They were the Sisters of Silence, the Silent Sisterhood. To most of the Imperium, they were little more than myth, half-remembered figures from the earliest days of the Emperor's reign. Yet their history was woven inseparably with that of the Adeptus Custodes, for they had once stood side by side in the wars that shaped humanity's fate. While the custodians were the Emperor's sword, the sisters were his shield against the unseen. They bore no psychic light, no trace of the warp's corruption. Their very presence unmade it. Each sister was a null, a blank space in the weave of the immaterium, an absence that caused demons to shriek and psychers to fall silent. To stand near them was to feel the soul recoil, as if standing before the edge of reality itself. They had been essential during the Great Crusade, walking with the Emperor himself as he brought worlds to his light. When the Horus heresy came, they fought on Terra's walls, their silent ranks standing beside the 10,000 during the siege. And when the war was done, when the Emperor was bound to the throne, the sisterhood faded into the shadows, their task complete, their numbers shattered. Some believed them extinct. Others whispered they still walked the dark between worlds, watching and waiting. The truth was quieter still. They had never left. They had simply hidden. For 10,000 years, the silent sisterhood endured in isolation. Across the galaxy, they maintained secret bastions, null sanctuaries, places so empty of psychic resonance that the warp itself recoiled from their walls. There, they lived lives of ritual and meditation. They spoke not with words, but with motion, with discipline, with absolute control of self. Their silence was not absence, it was presence, a statement to the warp. You shall have no dominion here. When the great rift split the galaxy, their long exile ended. The psychic scream that tore through creation, the wail of a billion souls lost to the storm, reached even the null sanctuaries. It did not touch them as it touched others, for the warp had no hold upon their kind, but they felt its shape, the distortion of reality itself, the bleeding of madness into the material realm. The universe was breaking, and when the custodians came seeking aid, the sisters answered without hesitation. They emerged from their sanctuaries as they had once done in the days of the Emperor, silent, serene, unbroken. Their reunion with the custodians was not one of ceremony or fanfare. There were no trumpets, no banners, only understanding. The 10,000 had always felt something close to reverence for the sisters. In their silence, the custodians saw a mirror of their own restraint. In their null nature, a reminder that even the mightiest warrior required balance. The sisters, for their part, had always understood the custodian's burden. They saw beyond the gold, beyond the perfection, saw the loneliness of eternal service. Together again, they became as they once were, the twin halves of the Emperor's will, strength and silence, fire and void. The sisters returned to war not with the thunder of battle hymns, but with quiet purpose. Where the warp erupted into madness, they went. Where demons tore through reality, they stood. To watch a sister of silence walk across a battlefield was to witness stillness made manifest. Around her, psychers screamed as their connection to the warp was severed. Demons flickered, shrank, and vanished like mist beneath the sun. Even the custodians, for all their will, could feel their thoughts dim in her presence, a humbling reminder of the limits of flesh and mind. And yet, they welcomed it. For in the sisters' silence, there was safety. The custodians came to rely upon them once more, especially as they ventured into the darker reaches of the galaxy, places where the warp bled most violently into the material realm. Together, they reclaimed temples consumed by corruption, sealed portals to the Imperium, and purged entire sectors where daimonic cults had taken root. They spoke little, these two ancient orders, but their cooperation was wordless perfection. One would guard, the other would strike. One would cleanse, the other would destroy. Between them, balance was restored, not peace, for peace had no meaning in their time, but equilibrium. In the years that followed, the sisters began to rebuild what had once been lost. New generations were trained. Young women born across the Imperium, whose psychic absence was a curse to most. but a calling to the sisterhood. They were gathered from orphanages, prisons, even battlefields. Wherever the Imperium cast out those it deemed soulless, the sisterhood found potential. Under their tutelage, these women learned silence not as suppression, but as strength. They became warriors of emptiness, bearers of the Emperor's quiet wrath. To the wider Imperium, the silent sisterhood was a mystery reborn. Priests of the ecclesiarchy whispered uneasily of them, for the sisters spoke no prayers. The Inquisition regarded them with a mix of awe and dread, for no psyker could hide in their presence. And to the common man, they were terrifying. Women whose very existence made the soul quiver and the mind ache. But the custodians knew better. They knew that without silence, even light would become noise. And so, the sisterhood once again took their place beside the Golden Guardians, the quiet echo to their blazing presence. Together, they stood guard not only over the Emperor's body, but over the fragile boundary between reality and the warp. For though the galaxy was fractured and the stars screamed with madness, there yet remained an equilibrium. A balance between power and restraint, between will and stillness, between light and the void that tempers it. The Emperor's dream was not dead, merely sleeping. And so long as the Sisters of Silence walked beside the custodians, that dream still whispered, faintly, enduringly, forever. Beneath the vast majesty of the imperial palace, beneath the golden domes and chanting halls, the earth itself remembered. Every chamber, every wall, every grain of sacred dust had been shaped by millennia of service, war, and silence. But some memories do not sleep. Some wait, patient, enduring, hungry. It began quietly, as all great disturbances do, an echo in the Mechanicus data chambers, deep beneath the Eternity Gate. A whisper of lost code, a pulse of power from a system long thought dead. The tech priests called it a resonance anomaly, a harmless flicker from the ancient conduits that fed the Golden Throne. Yet the custodians knew better. Nothing beneath the throne was harmless. They descended once again into the underworld of terror, the vaults of gold and steel that had once been the Emperor's laboratory, now a place of half-forgotten sanctity. There, amidst the endless hum of reactor cores and the ghostly glow of half-living machinery, they found something stirring. The corridors were older than any living man could comprehend, built in the dawn of the Imperium, when the Emperor himself had walked among his artisans and spoken the language of gods and atoms. But now the light within them pulsed with alien rhythm, irregular, discordant, as though something deep within the foundations had begun to breathe. And so began the war within the palace, a war not of armies, but of awakening. The custodians found the first of the intrusions near the vaults of Moravec, chambers sealed since the dark age of technology, where the Emperor had imprisoned relics that even he deemed too dangerous to destroy. The walls bore the faint scorch marks of energy discharge, their warding sigils flickering with unstable light. And in the center of the chamber, something waited, a construct of glass and bone, its form half organic, half machine. It did not move, it did not breathe, but every auger reading screamed of impossible activity. The tech priests called it a silica revenant, a remnant of a pre-imperial experiment. But the custodians felt the truth in their marrow. It was no machine. It was a memory given shape, a fragment of the Emperor's earliest works, something born from his attempt to conquer death itself. When they approached, the thing stirred. The light in its chest pulsed once, twice, then unfolded like a flower of glass. Within it burned not a soul, but an echo, a psychic residue so pure it resonated with the throne's power above. And then, as if recognizing their presence, it began to project images, visions, not words, not thoughts, but memories drawn from the golden age of the palace. The custodians saw the emperor, not as a god, but as a man cloaked in light. They saw him speak to artisans, guide warriors, shape the very matter of terror with a gesture. They saw the webway gate beneath the palace, the golden bridge between worlds, radiant and incomplete, and they saw it break. The chamber around them flickered with the vision of ancient disaster, flame, screaming, demons pouring from the void, the emperor himself sealing the gate with his blood. Then all light died, leaving only the silence of ancient failure. The construct fell still, its purpose fulfilled. But the custodians understood now. The war within the palace was not one of invasion, but of remembrance. Something deep below the throne was remembering itself into existence. The emperor's own experiments, his forgotten machines, his unfinished works, they were waking up. Each was a fragment of his will, incomplete and without guidance. Each was dangerous beyond imagining, and the custodians, who had sworn to protect his legacy, now faced a truth too vast for comfort. To protect the emperor, they might have to destroy his own creations. The campaign beneath the palace lasted months. Entire companies of the Custodes vanished into the lower vaults, never to return to sunlight. The air down there grew heavy, with the scent of ozone and old blood. Machines screamed as they died. Systems older than the Imperium itself were severed from the throne's network. Every battle was silent. No war cries, no screams, only the clash of gold and metal echoing in the hollow dark. The Sisters of Silence joined them, their null auras extinguishing the psychic turbulence that threatened to consume the lower vaults. Their presence was essential, for the deeper the custodians went, the more they realized that the enemy they fought was not of flesh or spirit, but of memory. Every machine down there dreamed, every wall remembered. It was as though the palace itself, the body of the emperor's work, had begun to think again. The culmination came when they reached the core of the vaults, the deepest place beneath terror. There, where even the Mechanicus had never tread, stood a chamber of impossible geometry, a machine that hummed with the same psychic frequency as the Golden Throne. It was not large nor grand, but it felt infinite. A mirror, perhaps, or a heart, and at its center burned a single ember of golden light. The custodians understood, though none dared speak the thought aloud. It was a reflection, an echo, of the Emperor's own power, cast off during his battle in the webway. A shard of his will, self-aware and unfinished. It pulsed weakly, as though yearning to rejoin the source above. And yet, its light felt different, softer, almost human. They sealed the chamber, locking it behind wards, older than reason. No record of its existence was ever entered into the archives. The Emperor's essence, however fractured, could not be allowed to wander free, for even his mercy might break the universe if unleashed. The custodians returned to the surface in silence. They carried no trophies, no proof of what they had found, only memory, and the heavy knowledge that even the palace of the Emperor was not beyond change. In the years that followed, the event became known only to a few within the 10,000. They spoke of it rarely, in hushed tones beneath the glow of the throne. Some called it the echo of the Emperor. Others dared to believe it was the first sign of his awakening, but most did not speculate. For speculation leads to faith, and faith, for the custodians, is a dangerous thing. They are not believers, they are watchers, and they know that even the brightest light must be kept from burning too hot. The war within the palace was never spoken of again. Yet from that day forward, the hum of the throne seemed a little different, deeper, warmer, almost as if the Emperor himself was listening. There are few truths in the Imperium more carefully hidden than the birth of the Emperor's Chosen. The Adeptus Custodes are legends made flesh, golden warriors beyond the measure of men, beyond even the might of the Adeptus Astartes. But they were not born divine. They were made. And to understand their making is to glimpse the very mind of the Emperor, the architect of perfection, the sculptor of living gods. Before the Great Crusade, before the Imperium even had a name, Terra was a graveyard. The ashes of the old knights still choked the world, its continents split by radiation storms, its skies black with the remnants of orbital wars. Humanity was scattered, devolved into tribes of scavengers and warlords. Gene-wrought monsters stalked the wastelands. Machines long since forgotten still fought meaningless wars, their programming twisted into madness. And amid that ruin, the Emperor walked alone. He did not rule, he observed. For centuries he wandered the dying planet, learning, studying, remembering. For he had seen humanity's rise before, and he knew its fall would come again. When at last he chose to act, his will reshaped the earth itself. He gathered the survivors, silenced the warlords, and forged the first city of unity, the Palace of Light, the foundation of what would one day become the Imperial Palace. But to rule the world, even the Emperor needed hands. At first, he created the Thunder Warriors, hulking, unstable brutes, crafted for conquest and slaughter. They won him terror, but their fury was unsustainable. They burned too hot, too fast. They were victory incarnate, but they were not permanence. When their purpose was done, he let them die. And from their ashes, he began his truest work, the creation of the Legio Custodes. Unlike the Thunder Warriors or the later Space Marines, the Custodians were not made in numbers. Each was crafted individually, hand-shaped by the Emperor's own genetic mastery. They were not simply given enhanced bodies, they were built with perfect purpose. Every strand of their being was tuned to precision, resilience, and grace. Each one was a unique creation, a reflection of the Emperor's will, made flesh. No two custodians were ever truly the same. They were not soldiers in the common sense. They were extensions of his mind. Thoughts given armor, purpose given form. Their creation took decades. Gene crafting, psychic conditioning, the implantation of memory, the tempering of soul. To craft a single custodian was an act of divine labor. To craft 10,000 was a work of eternity. The laboratories where they were made still exist, buried deep beneath the Imperial Palace, sealed and silent, their machines long dormant. Few living beings have ever seen them. Rows of glass cylinders stand empty now, the air thick with the scent of old alchemy and oil. Golden sarcophagi, cracked and silent, hold the remains of ancient experiments, failures, prototypes, and perhaps dreams. It is said that when the custodians pass these halls, they feel an echo of themselves there, a whisper of memory, a resonance of purpose. For in those forgotten chambers, their origin still breathes. In the age of their creation, the custodians were not yet warriors. They were guardians of the Emperor's works. They tended his laboratories, oversaw the construction of the Primarchs, and guarded the great gene vaults where the seeds of the Space Marines would one day be born. They saw the Emperor not as a god, but as a teacher, a master whose wisdom and will eclipsed all understanding. They watched him shape not just bodies, but souls, bending the Imperium itself to forge beings of purpose. And they learned. From his silence, they learned discipline. From his perfection, they learned humility. From his failures, they learned to endure. When the Primarchs were scattered by the ruinous powers, the Custodians were the first to see the Emperor's sorrow. They alone were present in those chambers when the stasis pods were found empty, when the Emperor's hand fell still upon the controls. They saw him close his eyes, not in rage, but in regret, and they knew then that even he, for all his power, could not master fate. That understanding shaped them more than any training ever could. It made them patient, silent, enduring. In the Great Crusade that followed, the Custodians became more than guardians. They became symbols. Where the Emperor walked, they walked beside him, not as servants, but as reflections. When he negotiated with alien kings, they stood motionless at his side, their presence alone enough to command obedience. When he led armies, they were the point of his spear, swift, decisive, terrible in their perfection. Yet even amid the glory of conquest, the Custodians never lost sight of their true purpose. They were not conquerors. They were keepers, keepers of the Emperor's vision, keepers of his truth, keepers of the fragile, endless dream of humanity's ascension. That dream died when the heresy came. The Custodians fought on the walls of terror until their golden armor ran red. They saw brothers die, worlds burn, gods fall, and when the dust settled, they were left alone, guardians of a silent throne and a galaxy drowned in superstition. Yet still, they did not falter, for they carried within them the memory of the man who had made them. They remembered his voice, his reason, his belief that mankind could rise without faith. Even now, after 10,000 years, that memory endures. Faint as a star seen through ash, but still burning. The Custodians do not pray to the Emperor. They do not worship. They remember. And that remembrance is its own form of worship. Colder, quieter, but truer. For while others kneel before the idea of a god, the Custodians stand watch over the truth of a man who sought to free humanity from gods. And though the galaxy no longer understands that dream, they remember. They always will. 10,000 years, a span of time so vast that even stars burn out and civilizations rise and fall within its shadow. For 10,000 years, the Adeptus Custodes have watched, unyielding, unmoving, unbroken. Their vigil has outlasted empires, faiths, and reason itself. They have seen the Imperium transform from the Emperor's dream of enlightenment into a shrine of blind devotion, and yet they have never turned away. The throne room of the Master of Mankind has not known silence in 10 millennia. It hums with the constant, relentless pulse of the Golden Throne, that vast, ancient machine upon which the Emperor sits in deathless stillness. Its power radiates through the palace, through the heart of terror, through the very fabric of the Imperium itself. It is the beacon that guides mankind through the warp, the psychic lighthouse known as the Astronomicon, and it is the burden the Custodians bear every day of their endless watch. For they can feel it, the faint psychic vibration of his will, the light that burns, steady yet weary, the whisper of a God who cannot die, yet cannot live. The passage of time has little meaning to the 10,000. They are not immortal, yet age does not touch them as it does men. Centuries pass, as seasons. Decades fall away like dust. Each custodian carries centuries of memory, the weight of 1,000 years of unending duty. They have watched comrades fall, replaced by initiates crafted in secret from the vaults below. They do not mourn as mortals mourn. For them, every loss is merely a dimming of the Emperor's light, a part of their perfection returned to the eternal whole. Outside the palace, the galaxy rots. Wars rage without end. Worlds burn in the name of faith, greed, and fear. The Adeptus Custodes, the Inquisition, the Ecclesiarchy, all proclaim their loyalty to the Emperor, yet none truly understand him. They fight for a God who never wished to be worshipped. They kill in his name, blind to the dream he died to protect. And so, within their gilded fortress, the custodians keep their silence. They do not correct. They do not judge. They simply remember. The years blur together in the palace's endless twilight, the echo of armored footsteps along marble halls, the eternal hum of the throne, the soft chanting of the choirs of the Adeptus Astronomica, their voices raised in psychic pain to fuel the Emperor's light across the stars. These sounds never cease. They are the heartbeat of eternity. And within it, the custodians stand, a living wall against despair. There are moments, rare, quiet moments, when even they falter, not in faith, but in thought. A flicker of doubt, a whisper of what if. They look upon the throne and wonder, is he still aware? Does he still see them? Or are they guarding only a memory, a corpse bound to machinery older than comprehension? Such thoughts are heresy to most. To the custodians, they are duty, for their faith is not in what the Emperor has become, but in what he was, the dreamer, the builder, the one who saw mankind not as servants, but as heirs to eternity. And even if that dream has withered beneath the weight of millennia, they will guard it still. Beyond the throne, the custodians maintain their duties in silence. They patrol the gilded corridors, the vaults of origin, the hall of the watchers. They inspect the seals on the ancient vaults beneath Terra. They train in the blood games, where their own kind play predator and prey, to ensure that no threat, not even from within, can ever take them by surprise. To the outside world, they are statues come to life. To themselves, they are memory given purpose. Each day, identical. Each moment, sacred. There are those among them who have never seen the sky, born within the palace, trained within its endless halls. They live and die beneath its golden roof, never once setting foot upon the soil of Terra beyond the gates. And yet, they know the stars better than any navigator, for they hear them through the Astronomican's song, the hum of the galaxy's pulse, translated through the Emperor's dying light. They know when a world falls, when a fleet is lost, when a system burns. Each flicker in the Astronomican is a death cry, a prayer unanswered, a spark extinguished. And still, they watch. In the long silence of the throne room, time itself feels thin. Dust gathers on gold. Statues erode from the breath of ages. Even light bends differently, slowed by the psychic pressure of the Emperor's will. There are moments when the custodians feel the weight of those years pressing down, the unbearable truth of endless vigilance. But then a sound, a change in the throne's hum, a flicker in the Astronomican's light, the faintest pulse of gold through the cracks of eternity. And in that moment, every custodian knows he's still there, not gone, not silent, enduring, just as they endure. For 10,000 years, the Adeptus Custodes have been the silent bridge between life and death, between man and God, between what was and what must never be lost. They do not dream, they do not hope, they remember. And in that remembrance, there is peace. When the galaxy finally dies, when the stars burn out and the last human breath fades into silence, there will still be one figure, golden and still, standing guard before a throne of light. And in that eternal moment, the Emperor's dream will not be gone, for his guardians will have kept it. Always, the stars beyond Terra are dimming. In the void between galaxies, the light of dying suns fades, swallowed by the endless black. Worlds fall silent, fleets vanish into the warp, and even the greatest empires tremble beneath the weight of their own decay. The Imperium endures, yes, but endurance is not life. It is a slow, unending resistance against the dark. And yet, on Terra, amid the ruin of ages and the silence of faith, there remains a light that has never gone out. It burns not in the sky, nor in the hearts of men, but in the heart of the imperial palace, within the golden throne, a light older than the Imperium, older than the stars themselves, a light that has been dimmed, fractured, burdened beyond all measure, but not extinguished. This is the Emperor's light, and those who guard it are the Adeptus Custodes, the Emperor's golden guardians, the living memory of a god, and the silent sentinels of his unending dream. The palace itself has become something other than architecture. It is not a place. It is a state of being. Its walls are woven from adamantium and gold, its towers reaching so high they pierce the upper atmosphere. Beneath those towers, miles of sacred corridors wind endlessly through strata of history. Some corridors built in the dawn of the Imperium, others laid over ruins so ancient their makers have no name. Cathedrals large enough to house entire cities stand empty, their spires shrouded in incense and shadow. Gilded statues of the Emperor gaze down from every arch, every ceiling, every gate, thousands upon thousands of eyes cast in metal, all fixed upon the throne. And always, there are the custodians. They stand like pillars of living gold, motionless yet alive, their armor reflecting the eternal light of the throne. No dust dares settle upon them, no shadow lingers too long. They are at once part of the palace, and apart from it, the will that animates its silent grandeur. Every sound in those sacred halls seems to bend around them. The distant hymns of the Adepta Sororitas, the whispering of incense smoke, the mechanical murmur of the mechanicals that tend the machinery of the throne. The custodians do not move, yet their presence fills the air like the memory of thunder. They are the still heart of the Imperium. Each custodian knows his place, his purpose, and his silence. Some stand eternal watch before the eternity gate. Guarding the threshold, none may cross without sanction. Others move unseen through the inner sanctums, checking the wards that bind the palace's foundations, ensuring the old machines below remain sealed, undisturbed, obedient. A few, the Shadow Keepers, dwell deep in the vaults where the Emperor's most terrible relics lie, weapons of the Dark Age, forbidden artifacts, and the remnants of experiments that even he would not trust to memory. Their duties never change, though centuries turn to millennia. Each breath they take is part of a ritual without end. Each moment of stillness is an act of devotion deeper than prayer, for they know that the Emperor does not require words. He requires vigilance. To watch is to serve. To remember is to love. Sometimes Within the deep chambers of the palace, the air hums with subtle change. The light flickers along the gilded floors. The throne murmurs with a sound that is not mechanical, not psychic, something older, something vast. And the custodians know he is stirring, perhaps only for a heartbeat, perhaps only in the faint movement of thought. But in that breath of eternity, they feel his awareness ripple through them like sunlight through still water. It is not speech, it is not command, it is remembrance returning. The Emperor, even in his boundless suffering, remembers his guardians. He knows them still, each one by name, by purpose, by soul. For they were not born of machine nor code, but of his will, sculpted from the deepest recesses of his design. And in that recognition, the custodians find meaning renewed. The galaxy beyond burns. Chaos gnaws at reality. The eye of terror yawns wide. Empires fall. Faith wavers. Even the space marines, the Emperor's angels of death, fracture and rebuild in endless cycles of war. But terror endures. The throne endures. The light endures. And it endures because the custodians endure. When the rest of mankind looks to the heavens and sees only war, they look inward, to the throne, and see purpose. They are the axis upon which the Imperium turns, unseen, unpraised, and unending. Each custodian is a living history, a memory of the golden age when the Emperor still walked among men. They recall his voice, his calm, his unshakable certainty. They remember the day he raised the first stone of the palace, the day he forged the first Primarch, the day he stood upon the ashes of unity and declared the birth of humanity's empire. They remember, and by that remembrance, they keep the dream alive. There are tales whispered among the servants of the palace, quiet, fearful tales told in the long hours of the watch. Some say that in the darkest hours of night, when the incense has faded and the choirs fall silent, golden figures walk the throne room floor in utter stillness, that they kneel before the Emperor, their helms bowed, and that the light of his throne glows brighter, as though answering their silent devotion. Others claim that they have seen a figure among them taller than any custodian, radiant beyond measure, a shape that cannot be looked upon directly, only sensed, as if the Emperor himself still walks among his guardians for the briefest of moments. These stories are never written down, never spoken aloud. But even among the 10,000, there are moments when they feel it, that pulse, that warmth, that eternal flicker of his presence, the light that never dies. Far above the palace, the storms of the warp rage. The Astronomicon burns like a star at the heart of the galaxy, guiding ships through madness, drawing the gaze of demons and gods alike. Its light is both beacon and barrier, a song that only psychics can hear, a harmony of agony and purpose that stretches across a million worlds. And within that light, though none can see it, the Emperor's essence burns. He is not gone. He is not dead. He is the still point around which all of humanity turns, a mind too vast to comprehend, a spirit too bound to break. He endures because his guardians endure, and his guardians endure because he does. They are not separate things, Emperor and Custodian. They are a single continuum of will. One is thought, the other is action. One is dream, the other is reality. Together, they have outlasted gods. Sometimes, in the quiet between battles, when all is still, and even the hum of the throne softens, the custodians feel something they cannot name. It is not pride, it is not sorrow. It is a vast, infinite calm, like standing at the edge of time and knowing that all things, no matter how vast, must one day return to silence. And they are content, For theirs is not a destiny of victory or redemption. Theirs is the destiny of endurance, to stand when all else falls, to hold the line when the stars themselves go dark, to be the last eternal reflection of the Emperor's golden dream, when all the armies of men are dust, when the last echo of the Imperium fades from the void, when even chaos itself forgets its name. There will remain, at the end of all things, a single light burning upon the throne of terror, and before it will stand a single figure, unmoving, eternal, radiant with purpose, a guardian, a custodian, the last of the 10,000. And in that endless night, when creation itself sighs its final breath, that golden figure will not weep, nor kneel, nor despair. He will simply watch, for that is what he was made to do, to guard, to remember, to be the light that never dies.